Every morning for 40 years, Agnes Winslow cleaned the same empty pigeonhole at the end of the Hollowmere post office. No letter had ever arrived there. No name was written above it. And yet she treated that little wooden space as though, one morning, someone might finally come to claim it. The village of Hollowmere had not yet opened its eyes when Agnes unlocked the door of the post office, the small brass bell above the frame giving its familiar, sleepy chime into the darkness. Frost clung to the window panes in soft feathered patterns, and the cobblestones outside still held the hush of night upon them. Agnes moved through the shadowed room the way she had moved through it for 40 years, her fingers finding the matches without needing to look, the little stove in the corner catching flame and beginning its low, comforting crackle. She had done this every morning of her adult life, rain or frost or golden summer light, and before she touched a single letter, before she so much as glanced at the morning's post waiting to be sorted, she would walk to the far end of the wooden sorting wall and dust that last pigeonhole first. Gently, carefully, as though something precious rested inside it, though nothing ever did. The other slots filled and emptied with the business of the village. Bills, letters from daughters married off to distant towns, seed catalogs, the occasional parcel wrapped in brown paper and string. But that last pigeonhole remained, always quietly waiting, tended before anything else in her day began. It was old Mr. Pemberton, delivering his weekly letter to his sister in Kent, who finally asked her about it one frostbright morning, his breath clouding in the cold air of the little shop. He had watched her dust that same empty slot dozens of times over the years and had never quite worked up the nerve to ask until that day. Agnes only smiled, the kind of smile that seemed to hold more behind it than it let show, and told him only that some habits simply outlive their reasons, and that a person could grow fond of a thing without needing to explain why. Mr. Pemberton, sensing there was no more to be had that morning, let the matter rest, the way most of Hollowmere had learned to let it rest. But the truth was that Agnes Winslow had never once, in 40 years, taken a single day away from that post office. Not when she was ill with fever one long winter. Not when the roads flooded and no post could come through for a week. Not even the year Beatrice Combe had begged her to come away for a holiday by the sea. She had always found some quiet reason to stay, always some small task that could not wait. Though everyone who truly looked at her could see it was not the post that kept her tethered to that room each morning before the sun had even climbed above the hills. What she was waiting for, no one in Hollowmere could say, and what had kept her, for 40 unbroken years, from ever once walking away from that small wooden pigeonhole at the end of the row, that, too, remained a question the village had long since stopped asking aloud, even as it lingered gently, in the quiet of every morning she opened that door. By the time the sun had properly risen over the hills surrounding Hollowmere, the post office had become the warm, breathing center of the village it always was. The stove crackled steadily now, filling the small room with a gentle heat that fogged the windows from the inside, and Agnes had long since finished her private ritual at the far pigeonhole and moved on to the true business of her morning. The mail coach would not arrive for another hour, but there was always sorting to be done, ledgers to be checked, and the quiet satisfaction of straightening a room that would soon fill with familiar faces. She liked this hour best of all, the hour before the village properly woke, when the post office still belonged entirely to her and the day's business had not yet begun to press in from every side. Beatrice Combe was always the first through the door, as she had been for longer than either woman cared to count. She came bearing a small parcel wrapped in cloth, still warm, the smell of fresh bread curling into the room before she did, and she never once, in all those years, arrived without some small offering tucked under her arm, as though it would have felt wrong to cross the threshold empty-handed. Beatrice ran the village bakery 2 doors down, rising each morning even earlier than Agnes to see to her ovens. And in all the years the two women had known each other, not a single morning had passed without some small offering passed between them. A warm roll, a kind word, a moment of shared quiet before the rest of the village stirred. They had grown up together, the two of them, daughters of neighboring shopkeepers, and there was a shorthand between them now that needed almost no words at all. A whole conversation carried sometimes in nothing more than a glance across the counter. Beatrice was the only person in Hollowmere who had ever pressed Agnes, gently and only once, about the empty pigeonhole at the end of the row. She had not gotten an answer that satisfied her curiosity, but she had never asked again, choosing instead to simply be present, morning after morning, in whatever way Agnes needed her to be, trusting that whatever Agnes carried, she would share it in her own time, if she ever chose to share it at all. Not long after, young Freddie Coombe would come tumbling through the door on his way to deliver the village's telegrams. His boots too big for his feet and his cap always slightly crooked, a satchel of messages bouncing against his hip. He was Beatrice's grandson, barely 12, all elbows and enthusiasm, and he had taken to treating Agnes as something between a favorite aunt and a second grandmother, lingering by the stove to warm his hands before dashing back out into the cold. He liked to tell her, breathlessly, whatever small news he had gathered on his rounds that morning, who had received a letter from a sweetheart, whose cow had wandered into the neighbor's field again, and Agnes always listened as though each report mattered a great deal, which, in its own small way, it did. She always found a moment for him, tucking a biscuit into his coat pocket or straightening his cap before sending him on his way, and there was something in the easy warmth between them that softened the sharper edges of her more private hours, a reminder that even a life spent largely alone could still hold real tenderness in it. The village moved through the post office in its own gentle rhythm as the morning deepened. Reverend Aldridge arrived with his usual bundle of correspondence, letters to distant parishes and quiet notes to families in mourning, and he always paused a moment longer at the counter than his letters required, his eyes resting on Agnes with a kind of understanding that never needed words. He was a man who kept many of the village's small sorrows folded quietly inside himself, having spent decades sitting at bedsides and standing beside gravesides, and there was an unspoken sense, felt by more than one person in Hollowmere, that he perhaps understood more about Agnes than he ever let show. He never asked her outright about the pigeonhole, or about whatever quiet grief seemed to shape her days, but he made a point, every so often, of asking after her well-being in a way that suggested he was truly listening for the answer, not merely offering the courtesy of the question. Farmers came in with letters to sons who had moved to the cities, mothers came to post packages to daughters starting families of their own, and each visitor left a little more of themselves behind in that small room, the way people do in places that have held their comings and goings for decades. There was Mrs. Halloway, who came every Tuesday without fail to post a letter to her sister in Bristol, and old Tom Fielding, who still wrote weekly to a nephew serving abroad, and the Ashworth girls, who took turns each week posting their letters to a cousin recently married and moved away. Agnes knew every hand that had ever written a letter across her counter. She knew the loops and slants of half the village's penmanship the way another woman might know their faces, and there was a particular kind of tenderness in the way she handled even the most ordinary piece of post, as though every letter carried within it something worth protecting, some small fragment of hope or worry or love that deserved to be handled with care rather than haste. It was easy, watching her move through her days this way, to imagine that Agnes Winslow had always simply belonged to that post office, as fixed and permanent as the stove in the corner or the old oak counter worn smooth by decades of elbows and letters. And in many ways she had come to belong to it. The villagers of Hollowmere had grown so accustomed to her steady presence that few of them stopped to wonder what her life might have looked like, had it turned a different way entirely, many years before any of them had known her. To the younger families in particular, Agnes seemed almost to have been born behind that counter. a fixture of the village rather than a woman who had once been young herself, who had once had dreams and plans that looked nothing at all like the quiet, solitary life she now led. If you find yourself settling into the gentle rhythm of Hollowmere this evening, feeling the quiet comfort of this little village wrap around you, the way it wraps around its own people, you are welcome to stay a while longer. Some listeners like to leave a small note in the comments about where in the world they are drifting off to sleep tonight, and if a story like this one is the kind of company you enjoy at the end of your day, you are always welcome to stay close to this channel for the next quiet evening we spend together. For now, though, let us return to the post office, and to Agnes, and to the small, unanswered corner of her life that the village had learned, so gently, to leave undisturbed. For there was a version of Agnes Winslow that Hollowmere had never known. A younger version, softer around the edges, who had once believed her whole life would unfold in an entirely different direction. And though the village saw only the steady, capable postmistress who opened her doors before dawn each morning, there was a quieter story folded beneath that surface, one that had never quite finished being told. There was, too, a particular quality to the way Agnes handled the post during the darker months of the year, when letters carried more weight than usual, bearing news of illness or hardship that the sender had not wanted to say aloud in a face-to-face conversation. She had learned, over the decades, to read the small signs of urgency in a hastily addressed envelope, the particular slant of handwriting rushed by worry, and she made a quiet habit of walking such letters to their recipients herself rather than waiting for them to be collected, sensing, correctly more often than not, that some news should not sit waiting in a pigeonhole a moment longer than necessary. It was this same instinct, villagers often remarked, that made her so much more than a mere keeper of the mail. She was, in her quiet way, a kind of steward of the village's whole emotional life, trusted with its griefs and its joys in equal measure, and carrying that trust with a gentleness that had endeared her to Hollowmere across the whole of her working life. 40 years is a long time to carry a story quietly, and yet Agnes Winslow had done exactly that, folding her past into the corners of her days the way a woman might fold a letter and tuck it into a drawer, not to be forgotten, but simply to be kept safe from the wear of everyday hands. To understand the woman who dusted an empty pigeonhole each morning before the sun rose, one had to go back to a version of Hollowmere that no longer quite existed, to a spring many decades gone, when Agnes had been young, and the village had been smaller still, and the world beyond the hills had felt impossibly far away. She had been 18 that spring, the daughter of the previous postmaster, a quiet and watchful girl who had grown up among letters the way other children grew up among livestock or looms. Her father had run the Hollowmere post office for 30 years before her, and Agnes had spent her girlhood perched on a stool behind the counter, sorting envelopes by hand long before she was tall enough to reach the higher shelves without help. She remembered, even now, the particular smell of that counter in her childhood, wax and ink and the faint mustiness of paper that had traveled a long way to reach it, and she remembered the quiet satisfaction of learning, letter by letter, to read the loops and slants of a stranger's handwriting and guess, correctly more often than not, what mood had shaped the hand that wrote it. She had known, even then, that she loved the quiet order of it, the sense that every letter carried a small piece of someone's life, and that to handle it with care was to honor something larger than the paper itself. Her mother had died when Agnes was young enough that the memory had softened into something more like a feeling than a face, a warmth she associated with lavender water and a particular hum of a lullaby whose words she could no longer quite recall. And it had been her father, patient and steady, who raised her largely alone in the years that followed, the two of them settling into a rhythm built around the post office and the small cottage behind it. He had taught her everything he knew of the trade, not because he expected the post office to become her burden one day, but because it was simply the world they shared, the language they spoke most easily to one another. He was not a man given to long conversations, her father, but he showed his love in other ways, in the careful attention he paid to teaching her the weight of a parcel by feel alone, in the way he always saved her the prettiest stamps from the foreign post to add to the small collection she kept in a biscuit tin, in the quiet pride he took in watching her grow steadily more capable behind that same counter he had tended for so many years himself. Agnes never resented the hours it asked of her. If anything, she found in it a steadiness she did not always feel elsewhere, a sense that the world, however uncertain it might seem beyond the hills, could always be sorted into orderly compartments, addressed and delivered and accounted for. It was in that spring, with the hills turning green again after a long winter, that she had first taken proper notice of Thomas Reed. He was a farmer's son from the eastern edge of the village, 2 years older than Agnes, with an easy laugh and a habit of finding reasons to walk past the post office on days when he had no letters to send at all. She remembered the first time she noticed him properly, not merely as one of the many young men who passed through Hollowmere's narrow lanes, but as someone whose presence she had begun, without quite realizing it, to watch for. He had come in one morning under the flimsiest of pretenses, asking after a parcel that had not yet arrived and would not arrive for another week at least, and had lingered at the counter far longer than the errand required, asking her small, ordinary questions about her day as though genuinely curious about the answers, and there had been something in the steadiness of his gaze, unhurried and entirely without pretense, that had stayed with her long after he left. It was not long after that first conversation that the village held its spring fair on the green, as it did every year at that season, with stalls of ribbon and honey cakes and a fiddler who played long into the evening while couples turned slowly beneath strings of paper lanterns. Agnes had gone that year with little expectation of anything beyond the usual pleasant evening among neighbors, and she remembered still, with a clarity that surprised her even now, the particular moment Thomas had crossed the green to ask her to dance. His hands a little unsteady, his usual easy confidence briefly abandoning him in a way she found, to her own surprise, rather endearing. They had danced twice that evening, longer than propriety strictly allowed for a young man and woman not yet formally courting, and though neither of them spoke of it directly in the days that followed, something between them had shifted, quietly and unmistakably, beneath the lantern light of that spring evening. Their courtship had unfolded the way courtships did in villages like Hollowmere, slowly and gently, built from small kindnesses rather than grand gestures. A sprig of heather picked from the hillside and left shyly on the counter, a shared bench outside the church on Sunday mornings, long walks along the river that wound its way past the edge of the village, where the water moved slow and silver beneath the willows. There was no single moment Agnes could point to afterward and say that this was when she had fallen in love with him. It had happened the way seasons change, so gradually that she could not have named the exact day summer became autumn, only that at some point she looked up and found the whole of her world had quietly rearranged itself around his presence in it. Thomas had a way of noticing things that others missed. He noticed when Agnes had not slept well, when her father's health had begun to trouble her, when the weight of the post office's responsibilities sat heavier on her young shoulders than she ever let show to the rest of the village. He would appear, without being asked, to carry the heavier parcels, or to sit with her in comfortable silence while she finished her sorting, content simply to be near her rather than to fill the quiet with unnecessary words. He had a farmer's patience, she often thought, a willingness to let things grow at their own pace rather than forcing them, and it was this quality, more than any other, that made her trust him so completely, so quickly, when she had never been a girl inclined to trust easily. He would speak, on their long walks, of the land his family worked, of the particular satisfaction of watching something planted in spring come to fullness by autumn, and Agnes found herself drawn to the steadiness of that vision. A life built patiently, season by season, on ground he understood and loved. It was the kind of love that did not announce itself loudly but settled instead into the ordinary hours of the day, until neither of them could quite remember a version of their lives that did not include the other. There were smaller moments, too, that Agnes carried with her long after, moments too slight to seem significant at the time and yet impossible to forget afterward. The afternoon Thomas had walked 3 miles out of his way simply to bring her a particular blue thread her father had need of, refusing any thanks beyond a smile. The Sunday he had sat with her outside the church, translating for her, with more patience than skill, the Latin phrases carved into the oldest of the gravestones, the two of them laughing quietly at his mangled attempts. The evening he had stood beneath her window in a light rain, not to serenade her as a bolder young man might have done, but simply to tell her, awkwardly and honestly, that he had thought of nothing else all day but the conversation they'd shared that morning. Agnes kept these small memories the way she kept everything precious to her, carefully, without ever needing to write them down, certain even then that she would never forget them, though she could not have known, on any of those ordinary afternoons, how completely those memories would come to sustain her in the decades that followed. There had been a particular afternoon, in the early autumn of that same year, when Thomas had walked with her along the river and pressed a small sprig of dried heather into her palm, telling her, in his quiet way, that he intended to marry her once he had saved enough to build them a proper start. He had spoken of it plainly, without flourish, the way he spoke of most things, describing a small cottage he had his eye on near his family's land, a patch of ground where he thought a garden might do well, a life laid out in the same careful, patient detail he brought to everything else. He told her he did not want to rush her into anything before he could offer her something solid, some real foundation rather than mere promises, and Agnes had loved him all the more for that carefulness, that unwillingness to offer her anything less than his whole, considered intention. Agnes had kept that sprig pressed carefully inside the pages of her father's old ledger book, and though the years would fade its color to little more than a whisper of purple-gray, she had never once removed it, not even decades later, long after the ledger itself had been retired to a shelf in the back room of the post office. Her father had liked Thomas, she remembered, in his own quiet way, never saying a great deal about the young man's suitability but softening, unmistakably, whenever Thomas visited the cottage, offering him tea and asking after the Reed family's harvest with a genuine interest that Agnes recognized as her father's particular form of approval. He had once told her, in one of the rare moments he spoke at length about anything personal, that he saw in Thomas the same patience he had valued in her own mother, and that he believed, quietly and without reservation, that Agnes had chosen well. It was one of the last truly untroubled conversations Agnes remembered sharing with her father before the world outside Hollowmere began, slowly and then all at once, to intrude upon the quiet certainties of village life. But the peace of that autumn did not last, as peace so often fails to do when history has other plans. Word came within the year that men were needed for the war, spreading through Hollowmere the way such news always spread through small places, first as rumor carried home from the market town, then as notices posted outside the church, and finally, all at once, as certainty that could no longer be avoided or discussed away over quiet cups of tea. Thomas, along with a dozen other young men from Hollowmere and the villages beyond it, answered that call with the quiet, resolute courage so many young men carried in that era, not because they longed for glory, but because it seemed the only decent thing to do, and because to stay behind while others went would have sat uneasily with a man of his character for the rest of his life. Agnes remembered the evening he told her of his decision, sitting together on the same bench outside the church where their courtship had so gently begun, his hand finding hers in the fading light, and though she had wept, quietly and without protest, she had never once asked him to reconsider, understanding even then that to ask such a thing of him would have been to ask him to become someone other than the man she loved. Agnes remembered, with a clarity that had never dulled, the morning he left, the mail coach waiting at the edge of the village green, The small crowd of mothers and sweethearts gathered to see their men off, handkerchiefs pressed to eyes that fought against showing too much in front of neighbors, and Thomas turning back one final time to find her eyes among the crowd, holding her gaze for a long moment before the coach pulled away, as though trying to carry the whole of her face with him, wherever he was going. The morning had been unseasonably cold for early spring, she remembered, frost still clinging to the grass along the green, and she had worn her mother's old shawl, the one thing of her mother's she still owned, as though some small piece of that earlier loss might lend her strength for this new one. He had made her a promise that morning, standing by the coach with his cap in his hands, his voice steady despite everything the moment carried. He told her that he would write to her every week if he could manage it, and that she should watch for his letters the way she watched for everyone else's. Only these, he said with a small smile, she was allowed to keep for herself. Agnes had promised, in turn, that she would be the one to receive them, that she would make certain no other hand touched his letters before hers, and that she would keep a place ready for him at the post office, a place that would remain his and his alone, until the day he came walking back through that door himself. He had smiled at that, a real smile despite everything, and told her that he liked the thought of it. A small space kept just for him in the one room in the village he associated most closely with her. It was a simple promise, the sort of thing young people say to one another in moments of parting, not fully understanding how heavily such words can come to rest on a life in the years that follow. But Agnes had meant it entirely, and in the weeks after Thomas left, she had done exactly as she said. She cleared a space at the end of the sorting wall, a single pigeonhole set apart from the rest, and she told her father, with a seriousness that made him pause and look at her more closely than usual, that this slot belonged to Thomas Reed alone, and that any letter arriving for him was to be placed there, and there only until he came to collect it himself. Her father, who had seen enough of the world to recognize what such a request truly meant, said nothing to discourage her, only nodded and let her have her way, as he always had, though she caught, once or twice in the weeks that followed, a certain gentleness in the way he watched her tend that small empty space each morning, a tenderness that told her he understood exactly what she was holding on to, and why. For the first several months, that pigeonhole had not been empty at all. Thomas kept his promise faithfully, his letters arriving with a steadiness that brought Agnes a quiet, private joy she carried through even the dreariest of her days. He wrote of the long marches, described carefully so as not to worry her, and always circled back in every letter to memories of home, the sound of the river, the smell of Beatrice's mother's bread, the particular slant of afternoon light across the village green. Agnes read every letter twice before she allowed herself to file it away in the small wooden box she kept beneath her bed, and she wrote back just as faithfully, filling her own letters with the small, steady details of a village continuing on without him, so that he would always have a clear thread leading him home. It was during those months that Agnes came to understand something about herself that she had perhaps always known in some quiet corner of her heart. She was, by nature, a keeper of things, a keeper of letters, of promises, of the small, fragile hopes that people entrusted to her care, whether they realized they were doing so or not. It was this quality, more than any other, that would come to define the whole of her life, long after the reasons for it had grown blurred and distant with time, and long after the village around her had stopped quite remembering why their postmistress guarded one small pigeonhole so carefully, as though it still, somehow, belonged to someone who might one day walk back through that door. Agnes remembered, too, the particular ease she felt in his company, a comfort she had not expected to find so young, having always imagined that real understanding between two people took years to build rather than months. With Thomas, she found she could sit in silence without the silence feeling like absence, could speak her half-formed thoughts aloud without fear of being misunderstood, could simply exist beside him without the careful self-consciousness she felt in most other company. Her father once remarked, watching the two of them sit together on the garden bench one quiet Sunday afternoon, that he had rarely seen two people so at ease in each other's presence, and Agnes had treasured that observation, tucking it away alongside all her other small, precious memories of that gentle, unhurried courtship. It was into this long, settled rhythm of village life that the stranger arrived, on an ordinary autumn morning much like any other, though it would prove to be a morning unlike any Hollowmere had seen in decades. The leaves along the riverbank had only just begun to turn, the hedgerows still holding on to the last green of summer, and there was nothing in the pale morning light to suggest that anything at all was about to change in a village that had, for so long, changed very little from one season to the next. The air carried that particular sweetness peculiar to early autumn, the smell of ripening apples from the orchards beyond the church and the first wood smoke of the season curling up from a few early chimneys, and the whole of Hollowmere seemed, on that morning, entirely unaware of what its own quiet history was about to reveal. He came on the morning coach from the nearest railway town, a young man perhaps in his 30s, dressed in the manner of someone from London rather than from any village Hollowmere's residents might have recognized. His coat was cut close and modern, his shoes too fine for the muddy lane leading up from the coach stop, and more than one villager paused at their morning tasks to watch him pass, curious in the mild, unhurried way that small places are curious about anything unfamiliar. The coach driver, an old hand at the route who knew every regular passenger by name, had remarked to no one in particular that he'd never carried this particular fare before, and had watched with some curiosity as the young man climbed down and stood for a long moment on the village green, looking about him as though trying to place himself against some picture he had carried in his mind for a very long time. He carried with him a single worn leather trunk, heavier than his frame seemed to suggest, its corners scuffed pale with age and its leather straps cracked from decades of being buckled and unbuckled, and he moved through the village with the careful, curious attention of someone seeing a place for the first time yet searching, somehow, for something familiar within it. He paused first at the village green, setting the trunk down for a moment to get his bearings, looking up at the old stone church and the row of shops beyond it with an expression that seemed, to the few who noticed, less like a tourist's idle interest and more like a man trying to match a place in his mind to a place he had only ever heard described secondhand. Mrs. Halloway, sweeping the step outside her cottage, was among the first to notice him properly, and later told anyone who would listen that she had known at once, somehow, that this was no ordinary visitor passing through on his way elsewhere. There was something in the careful, almost reverent way he studied the row of shops and the old stone bridge, she said, that suggested a man looking not merely at a village but at a story he already half knew, searching for the places where that story had once unfolded. She had offered him a polite good morning, which he returned warmly enough, though his attention seemed only half given to her, the rest of it caught somewhere in the middle distance, on the church spire, on the curve of the river visible beyond the rooftops. He introduced himself around the green as Peter Reed, offering the name easily to the handful of villagers who greeted him, and though the surname alone was enough to draw a few curious glances from the older residents, glances that lingered a moment longer than politeness required, it was not until he made his way toward the post office that the full weight of his arrival would begin to settle over Hollowmere. Old Tom Fielding, who had lived his whole long life in the village and remembered a great many things others had long since forgotten, was heard to remark to his wife that evening that he hadn't heard that particular surname spoken aloud in Hollowmere in longer than he cared to count, and that it had given him a strange, unsettled feeling to hear it fall so casually from a stranger's mouth. He had come, he explained to those who asked, on a matter of family research, tracing branches of his family tree that led back, through records and old letters passed down through generations, to a great-uncle who had once lived in this very village before the war had taken him. He carried with him, in that heavy leather trunk, a collection of old family papers, photographs, and correspondence that had been kept, largely untouched, in an attic in London for the better part of a century, inherited most recently from an aunt who had passed the previous winter and left the trunk, along with a note explaining its contents deserved proper attention, entirely to him. He admitted, to anyone patient enough to listen, that he had put off opening it himself for the better part of a year, uncertain what he might find inside, and that it was only in recent months, in the quiet after his aunt's passing, that he had finally worked up the resolve to go through it properly. He spoke, when pressed gently by curious villagers, of a modest but steady career in London, something to do with archives and old records, a profession that had perhaps made him more comfortable than most with the slow, careful work of piecing together a family's scattered history from fragments. He had never married, he mentioned once in passing to Reverend Aldridge, and had often wondered, in recent years, about the family members who had come before him, the ones whose stories had thinned with each retelling until barely more than a name and a vague outline remained. His aunt's trunk, arriving as it had in the wake of her death, had felt to him less like an inheritance and more like an unanswered question finally placed directly in his hands, one he could no longer politely set aside. Reverend Aldridge was the first in the village to speak with him at any real length, encountering Peter near the churchyard as the young man paused to study the old headstones, searching, he admitted, for any trace of a name he had found scattered throughout the papers in his trunk. The Reverend had lived in Hollowmere for most of his adult life, and there were few names carved into those old stones he did not recognize on sight, few families whose histories he could not trace back several generations if asked. He walked slowly among the rows with Peter that morning, the two of them moving companionably between the weathered stones, the Reverend pointing out this family or that, answering Peter's questions with the same patient care he brought to every conversation, and it was only when Peter finally spoke the name Thomas Reed aloud, turning it over almost experimentally, that something in the Reverend's expression shifted, quiet and considering. The Reverend paused at that, his hand resting for a moment against the cold stone of a nearby marker, and studied the young man before him with fresh attention, noting, for the first time, a certain familiar set to his jaw, a particular way of tilting his head when listening that struck some faint chord of memory, though the Reverend could not have said, in that moment, exactly where the resemblance came from. He said nothing of what that name meant to the village just yet, only that he did not believe Thomas Reed was buried among these particular stones, for the young man in question had never returned to Hollowmere to be laid to rest here at all. He watched Peter's face carefully as he said this, gauging how much the stranger already understood of his own family's history, and found, in the young man's puzzled, earnest expression, a clear answer. Whatever fragments of the story Peter had gathered from his grandmother and his aunt over the years, they were incomplete, softened perhaps by distance and time, the way family stories so often are by the time they reach a third generation. Peter explained, standing there among the quiet stones with the autumn light slanting long and golden across the churchyard grass, that his grandmother had rarely spoken of her lost brother beyond the barest details, that the family had understood only that he had died somewhere abroad during the war and had never been returned home, his final resting place unknown even to those who had loved him most. He confessed that he had come to Hollowmere with only a handful of certainties, gathered mostly from the faded return address on a few old envelopes and the occasional mention of the village's name in his grandmother's sparse recollections, hoping to find, if nothing else, some sense of the place his great-uncle had called home before the war had taken him from it. The Reverend listened to all of this with the quiet attentiveness that had made him, over so many years, a trusted confidant to nearly every family in Hollowmere, and when Peter finished speaking, he was quiet himself for a long moment, turning something over in his own mind before he spoke again. It was Reverend Aldridge, with the same gentle wisdom he had shown the village for decades, who suggested, in his unhurried way, that Peter might find what he was truly looking for not among the old stones of the churchyard, but at the small post office on the corner of the green, where a woman named Agnes Winslow had spent a lifetime keeping careful watch over exactly the kind of history he seemed to be seeking. He offered no further explanation, only a quiet, knowing look that suggested there was more to be learned there than anywhere else in the village, and a suggestion that Peter might wish to go gently, and to listen more than he spoke when he arrived. Peter thanked him, sensing something significant in the Reverend's careful tone, though he could not have said exactly what, and made his way there directly, the leather trunk still in hand, his footsteps unknowingly carrying him toward a door that had, in one form or another, been waiting for this very moment for the better part of 40 years. The morning had grown a little warmer by then, the frost burning off the hedgerows under a pale autumn sun, and the village around him carried on with its ordinary business, entirely unaware that the quiet, unremarked upon story it had lived alongside for 4 decades was, in that very hour, about to begin its slow unraveling. He walked the short distance from the churchyard to the village green with the trunk growing heavier in his grip, passing the bakery where Beatrice, glancing up from her morning trade, watched him pass with the same mild curiosity the rest of the village had shown him, though something in his direction, toward the post office rather than away from it, caught her attention in a way she could not quite name. She would remember, later, standing in her own doorway for a moment longer than necessary, watching the stranger's back as he crossed the green, some small unsettled feeling stirring in her without any clear cause, the vague sense that something in the ordinary rhythm of the morning had shifted, though she could not have said what or why. The small brass bell above the post office door gave its familiar chime as Peter stepped inside, and Agnes looked up from her counter with the same warm, practiced welcome she offered every visitor, a welcome that faltered, ever so slightly, the moment Peter set down his trunk and began, in his gentle and earnest way, to explain the nature of his visit, and the name of the great-uncle whose scattered history had led him here. He spoke without any particular urgency, unaware of the effect his words were having, describing his research and his family's papers with the same easy manner he had used with the Reverend and with the handful of villagers he had already met that morning, entirely unprepared for what those words might mean to the woman standing across the counter from him. The room seemed to grow very quiet around her as he spoke. The stove continued its low crackle in the corner. The morning light continued to fall softly through the frosted window panes. The ordinary business of dust motes drifting lazily through a sunbeam continued undisturbed, and yet something in Agnes Winslow had gone suddenly, entirely still, as though the whole of the post office, and the whole of the village beyond it, had paused to hold its breath alongside her. 40 years of careful, practiced composure gathered themselves in that single moment, and though her hands remained steady on the counter, though her expression betrayed only the mildest, most polite attention to a stranger's story, something deep within her had already begun, quietly and irrevocably, to shift. Word of the stranger's arrival had, by mid-morning, already begun its quiet circuit through Hollowmere, the way any unusual news traveled through a village so small that little escaped notice for long. Mrs. Halloway mentioned it to the baker's boy delivering her morning loaf, who mentioned it in turn to his own mother, who mentioned it, before the hour was out, to 2 of her neighbors over the garden fence, until by midday there was scarcely a household in Hollowmere that had not heard some version of the tale. A young man from London, a leather trunk, a great-uncle lost in the war. The details grew slightly with each retelling, as such details always did, though the essential shape of the story remained the same, and more than one villager found themselves glancing toward the post office that morning with a curiosity they could not quite explain, sensing, in some vague and unspoken way, that this stranger's arrival carried more weight than his quiet, unassuming manner suggested. Beatrice heard the news from her own delivery boy before she had even opened her shop for the morning trade, and something in the mention of the name Reed had made her pause mid-task, a loaf half-wrapped in her hands, though she could not have said, in that first moment, exactly why the name troubled her so. It was only walking to the post office later that afternoon, her thoughts turning over the morning's gossip, that she remembered, with a small jolt, the name Agnes had once mentioned to her only a single time, decades before, in a rare unguarded moment neither of them had ever spoken of again. She quickened her step without quite deciding to, an uneasy feeling gathering in her chest that she could not yet name. Reverend Aldridge, for his part, spent a long while alone in the quiet of the church after Peter had gone, standing before the altar with his hands folded, turning over in his mind everything he knew of Agnes Winslow's long, careful silence. He had known her the whole of his ministry in Hollowmere, had watched her tend that small pigeonhole morning after morning without ever once asking her directly what it meant to her, respecting, as he always had, the private corners of a person's grief. He wondered now, standing in the hushed light of the church, whether he had done right in sending Peter to her, or whether he had simply set in motion something that might prove more painful than healing. But he trusted, in the end, as he had trusted through so many years of quiet pastoral care, that truth, however difficult, was generally kinder in the long run than a lifetime of unanswered questions. And he said a small, private prayer for Agnes as he locked the church doors behind him that afternoon. The village green, meanwhile, carried on with its ordinary autumn business, entirely unaware of the quiet reckoning taking shape within the walls of its small post office. Children chased one another between the market stalls being set up for the coming weekend fair. A farmer's cart rattled past laden with the last of the season's apples, and the ordinary rhythm of Hollowmere continued exactly as it always had, indifferent to the fact that within one small room on the corner of the green, for decades of careful, quiet waiting were about to be gently, irrevocably disturbed. Agnes recovered herself after a long moment, drawing on the same quiet composure that had carried her through so many difficult mornings over the years, and busied her hands with the small, familiar task of clearing a space on the counter for Peter to set down his trunk properly, grateful for the brief distraction the motion offered. She asked him, in a voice she was pleased to hear come out steady, whether he had traveled far that day, and listened to his easy account of the journey from London with only half her attention, the rest of her mind circling back, again and again, to the name he had spoken so casually only moments before. She noticed, as he spoke, small details about him that seemed, the longer she looked, to carry an unsettling familiarity. The particular way he tilted his head when considering a question, not unlike a gesture she remembered from decades before, the shape of his jaw beneath a few days' unshaven stubble, the easy, unhurried manner of a man in no particular rush to be anywhere else. She told herself, firmly, that she was imagining resemblances that could not possibly exist, that grief and memory had a way of finding echoes where none were truly present, and yet the feeling persisted, quiet and insistent, beneath the surface of their polite conversation. When Peter asked, gently, whether she might be willing to look through some of what the trunk contained, Agnes found herself agreeing before she had fully considered the request, drawn forward by a pull she could neither explain nor resist. She suggested, her voice carefully even, that he might return the following afternoon, when the post office was quieter and she could give his family's history the fuller attention it seemed to deserve, and Peter, sensing nothing beyond ordinary courtesy in the request, agreed readily, thanking her for her time and gathering his trunk to take his leave. It was only once the small brass bell had chimed behind him, once she was alone again in the familiar quiet of her post office, that Agnes allowed herself to lean, for just a moment, against the edge of her counter, her legs unexpectedly unsteady beneath her. She looked, almost without meaning to, toward the far end of the sorting wall, toward the small pigeonhole she had tended so faithfully for so long, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a tremor of something she had almost forgotten how to name. Hope, perhaps, though she was not yet ready to call it that. or perhaps only the disturbance of a stillness she had spent 40 years carefully, deliberately maintaining, now unsettled by a stranger's ordinary, unknowing arrival. She busied herself, in the hour that followed, with the ordinary tasks of the post office, sorting the afternoon's remaining letters with hands that moved through familiar motions even as her mind continued to circle back, again and again, to the conversation that had just passed. She found herself glancing, more than once, toward the door, half expecting Peter to return with some further detail she had not yet had time to absorb, though she knew he would not come again until the following day as they had agreed. The village outside continued its ordinary autumn business, entirely unaware of the quiet upheaval taking place within the small room on the corner of the green, and Agnes found some comfort, strange as it seemed, in that very ordinariness, in the reminder that whatever might come of this stranger's visit, the steady rhythm of Hollowmere would carry on around her regardless. For a long moment Agnes said nothing at all. She simply stood behind her counter, one hand resting lightly against the worn wood, looking at this young stranger who carried Thomas's name so easily on his tongue, as though it were an ordinary thing to say aloud in that small room, rather than a word that had not been spoken there in longer than Peter himself had been alive. The silence stretched long enough that Peter shifted, uncertain, wondering if he had somehow given offense, though he could not have said how. When she finally found her voice, it was steady, though quieter than usual, and she told him only that she had known a Thomas Reed once, many years before, and that she would be glad to hear whatever he had come to share. Peter, sensing perhaps that he had stumbled into something more significant than he had anticipated, spoke carefully, unpacking the story his family had carried forward across the generations in the way such stories often survive, worn smooth and slightly altered by every retelling. His grandmother, he explained, had been Thomas's younger sister, a girl barely into her teenage years when her brother had left for the war and never returned. She had grown up, married, moved eventually to London, and had spoken of her lost brother only rarely, though always with a tenderness that suggested his memory had never fully settled into the past for her, no matter how many years passed. Peter recalled, as a boy, being shown a single faded photograph on rare occasions, his grandmother's fingers tracing the edge of the frame in a way that told him, even then, that the man in the picture mattered more than the sparse words she offered about him. He described, haltingly, the little he had gathered over the years from family gatherings and half-finished conversations, that Thomas had been well-liked, that he had left behind someone he cared for deeply in the village of his birth, though no one in the family had ever known her name, only that she existed, a shadowy figure at the edge of a story otherwise lost to time. Agnes listened to this last detail with a stillness that took considerable effort to maintain, saying nothing, giving away nothing beyond the polite attention any listener might offer a stranger's family history. It was from this grandmother, and later from the aunt who had inherited her belongings, that the trunk now resting beside Peter's feet had come into his keeping. Inside it, he told Agnes, were photographs, a few of Thomas's personal effects returned after the war, and a modest collection of letters, though he admitted, almost apologetically, that the family had never been entirely certain of the full story behind Thomas's final months. Only the barest official details that had been provided at the time, details that had grown thinner and less certain with every passing generation that retold them. He mentioned, too, that his aunt had always intended to look through the trunk properly herself, to perhaps trace down whatever remained of the family Thomas had left behind in the village, but that life and its ordinary demands had gotten in the way, year after year, until the task had simply never been done, and now fell to him instead. Agnes listened to all of this with the careful, practiced stillness of a woman who had spent 40 years receiving other people's stories with grace, though something in her had begun, quietly, to gather and tighten as Peter spoke. It was when he mentioned, almost in passing, the date given in the family's records for the engagement in which Thomas had been lost, that Agnes felt a small, cold uncertainty stir beneath her composure, for the date he named did not sit quite right against the memory she had carried unquestioned for the whole of her adult life. She said nothing of it in that moment, only asked him gently to repeat what he had said, and listened again as he did, turning the date over in her mind the way she might turn over an unfamiliar coin, searching for some flaw or explanation. She excused herself briefly, on the pretext of fetching tea from the small kettle she kept warm through the mornings, and used those few private minutes in the back room to steady herself, pressing her palms flat against the cool wood of the shelf where her father's old records were still kept, breathing slowly until the strange tightness in her chest began to ease. When she returned with 2 cups, her hands were steady again, and if Peter noticed anything unusual in her brief absence, he was too polite or too absorbed in his own story to remark upon it. She said nothing of this discrepancy to Peter that first afternoon, telling herself it was likely nothing more than the natural blurring that happens to dates across decades and generations, passed down through second-hand memory rather than first-hand record. Families remembered things imperfectly, she reminded herself, and grief in particular had a way of shifting the small details of a story even as it preserved the larger shape of it. But the small unease remained with her long after Peter had thanked her for her time and taken his leave that afternoon, promising to return the following day to continue looking through whatever records the village might hold, and it followed her home that evening, settling uneasily alongside her as she sat by her own small fire, turning the pressed sprig of heather between her fingers the way she had done on so many quiet nights before. She thought, that evening, of writing to the War Office once more, as she had done decades before in those first uncertain months, though she knew even as the thought crossed her mind that any records from so long ago would be unlikely to yield anything new after all this time. Instead she simply sat, as she so often had, with her memories laid out before her like objects on a table, turning each one over, searching them for some detail she might have misremembered, some small crack through which a different truth might show itself. Peter returned the next morning as promised, and in the days that followed, a quiet, unhurried friendship began to form between the young Londoner and the village's longtime postmistress, one built on his patient curiosity and her careful, guarded willingness to share what she remembered. He would come by the post office in the slower hours of the afternoon, once the morning's post had been sorted and delivered, and Agnes would set aside her ledgers to sit with him near the stove, answering his gentle questions as fully as she was able, though there remained certain corners of her memory she was not yet ready to open, even for him. He asked, over those first few afternoons, about the village as Thomas would have known it, about the river and the church and the old stone bridge, and Agnes found, to her own quiet surprise, that she enjoyed the telling, that describing Hollowmere through the eyes of the young man Thomas had once been brought her a comfort she had not expected. Beatrice, noticing the young stranger's regular visits to the post office, could not help but remark on it one morning as she set down her usual warm parcel, asking Agnes, with the easy familiarity of a lifelong friend, what business a Londoner might have with an old postmistress that required quite so many afternoons of conversation. Agnes had deflected the question as gently as she deflected most such questions, saying only that the young man was doing some family research and that she was glad to help where she could, and Beatrice, sensing there was more beneath the surface than her friend was yet willing to share, let the matter rest, though not without a lingering, curious glance that told Agnes her old friend's instincts had not dulled with the years. It was during one of these afternoons, as Peter carefully unpacked a small bundle of photographs from the trunk, laying them out one by one across the counter with the reverence of a man handling something far more fragile than paper, that Agnes found herself looking, for the first time in decades, at a young man's face that had lived, until that moment, only in the softened edges of her own memory. The photograph was slightly faded, taken not long before Thomas had left for the war, and though the paper had yellowed with age, his easy smile remained exactly as she remembered it, exactly as it had looked on the last morning she had seen him standing beside the mail coach with his cap in his hands. She reached out, almost without meaning to, and touched the edge of the photograph with one careful finger, as though confirming to herself that it was real, that this was truly him and not merely her memory conjuring his face once more. Agnes held the photograph for a long while, and Peter, with a sensitivity beyond his years, said nothing, allowing her the silence she needed, occupying himself instead with sorting through the remaining contents of the trunk while she sat with the image in her hands. There were other photographs too, one she had never seen, Thomas as a boy on his family's land, Thomas among a group of fellow soldiers, his smile unmistakable even amid the unfamiliar faces surrounding him, and each one Agnes studied with the same slow, careful attention, filling in, piece by piece, the years of his life she had never been permitted to witness firsthand. When she finally spoke, it was to ask, quietly, whether the trunk contained any of Thomas's own letters, the ones he might have written home during his final months. And it was here that Peter's expression shifted into something more careful, more hesitant than it had been before, and he set down the papers he had been holding to give her his full attention. There was, he admitted, one letter that had never been fully accounted for. According to family lore passed down from his grandmother, Thomas had written a final letter shortly before the engagement in which he was lost, a letter intended for someone back home, though the family had never been entirely certain of its recipient, nor of what had ultimately become of it. Somewhere in the confusion of that period, amid the slow and often unreliable postal routes serving the front lines, the letter had simply never reached wherever it had been going. It had been returned, eventually, to the family itself, undelivered and unopened, the address on its front too damaged or too incomplete for the postal service of the time to make any sense of it, and had remained tucked among Thomas's returned personal effects ever since, a small, sealed mystery that no one in the intervening generations had ever felt it was their place to open. Agnes felt something shift within her chest at these words, a slow, careful unfolding of something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She asked, as steadily as she could manage, whether Peter might be willing to bring that letter with him the following day, and he agreed readily, sensing, even without being told directly, that this particular piece of paper carried a weight far beyond its worn and yellowed exterior, and that whatever it contained belonged, in some way he did not yet fully understand, more to the woman sitting across from him than to anyone else still living. That night Agnes did not sleep well. She sat for a long while at her small writing desk, in the modest cottage she had lived in alone for so many years. The fire burned low and the wind pressing gently at the shutters, and found herself opening the bottom drawer she rarely touched, the one that held her father's old ledger book, its pages brittle now with age. She turned carefully to the place where the pressed sprig of heather still rested. Its color faded almost entirely to gray, and she allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to simply sit with the fullness of what she had carried for so long, without trying to organize it into anything tidy or explainable. She thought of Thomas as she had known him, and Thomas as the stranger's family had remembered him, and wondered, with a quiet, trembling hope she barely allowed herself to name, what those two versions of him might have to say to one another, if only she let them. She thought, too, of all the years she might have spent differently, had she known then what she was only now beginning to suspect, and found, to her own surprise, that the thought carried less bitterness than she might have expected. There would be time enough, she told herself, to sort through whatever feelings the coming days might bring. For now, there was only the quiet, steady work of waiting one more night, the same patient waiting she had practiced for 40 years, though this time, she sensed, it would be waiting of an entirely different kind. When Peter arrived the next afternoon, he carried with him a small, worn envelope, its paper soft with age, The ink of its address faded nearly to illegibility, though enough of it remained for Agnes to recognize, with a jolt that reached all the way to her very bones, the careful, familiar slant of Thomas's handwriting, and beneath it, though faded almost to nothing, the beginning letters of her own name. She did not open it immediately. She held it instead, turning it over gently in her hands, feeling the weight of 4 decades pressing down upon that single small piece of paper, and Peter, watching her, understood without needing to be told that whatever this letter contained, it belonged to a story far older and far more tender than anything he had come to Hollowmere expecting to find. She asked him, quietly, whether he would allow her the evening alone with it, and he agreed at once, gathering the rest of the trunk's contents and promising to return the following morning to hear whatever she felt willing to share. As he made his way toward the door, the small brass bell chiming softly behind him, Agnes remained exactly where she was, seated near the stove with the letter resting in her lap, her fingers hovering just above the worn seal that had gone unbroken for the better part of 40 years, uncertain, in that trembling, suspended moment, whether she was ready at last to learn what it might finally reveal. Peter spoke, too, of the little his family had gathered over the years about the kind of man Thomas had been, fragments passed down through his grandmother's occasional remembrances, that he had been well liked by those who served alongside him, that he had a reputation, even among fellow soldiers, for a particular steadiness under difficult circumstances, a calm that others found reassuring when their own nerves ran thin. Agnes listened to this with a quiet ache of recognition, for it matched so precisely the young man she had known, the same unhurried steadiness that had first drawn her to him on an ordinary spring morning so many decades before. He mentioned, too, that his grandmother had kept, among her few possessions, a small tin of medals and service records, official documents she had never fully understood and had rarely shown to anyone, tucked away in a drawer for most of her adult life. Peter had gone through these himself only in recent months. He admitted, cross-referencing what dates and details he could against the family's oral history, trying to piece together a fuller, more accurate account than the version that had been passed down, softened and simplified, through 3 generations of retelling. It was in describing this process, this careful cross-referencing of official record against family memory, that Peter first mentioned the specific engagement in which Thomas was believed to have been lost, along with the date recorded in what remained of the official paperwork. Agnes felt herself go very still at this, though she gave no outward sign of it, filing the date away carefully in her mind even as she continued to nod along with Peter's telling, waiting for a quieter moment to examine what she had just heard against the memory she had carried, unquestioned, for the whole of her adult life. In the days that followed, their conversations widened beyond the strict business of family history, settling into something closer to genuine friendship. Peter asked Agnes, one slow afternoon, what Hollowmere had been like in her own girlhood, and she found herself telling him small stories she had not thought of in years, of her father's careful teaching behind this very counter, of childhood errands run along the same cobblestone lanes he had walked that first morning, of the particular quality of light that fell across the village green in autumn, unchanged across all the decades between the Hollowmere Thomas had known and the one Peter was only now discovering for himself. Peter, in turn, spoke of his own life in London, of the quiet, solitary work he did among old records and archives, of an aunt who had raised him for a time after his own parents' early passing, of the strange, unmoored feeling of inheriting a family history he had never properly learned to hold. Agnes listened to him with the same careful attention she brought to every letter that crossed her counter, recognizing in his quiet manner something of the same steadiness she had once loved in Thomas, though she said nothing of this observation aloud, keeping it instead as a small private tenderness she allowed herself in those slow afternoon hours by the stove. It was during one such afternoon, as the light outside began its early autumn fade toward evening, that Peter mentioned, almost as an aside, a detail from his grandmother's recollections that made Agnes's breath catch quietly in her throat, that his grandmother had once said, in one of her rare unguarded moments, that her brother had written home more faithfully than any of them, right up until the very end, and that it had always troubled her, in some small unresolved way, that no final letter had ever properly reached whoever it had been intended for. Agnes said nothing in response beyond a quiet, careful nod, though something in her had already begun, in that moment, to suspect what the coming days might finally reveal. She excused herself again that afternoon, this time with less composure than before, and stood for a long moment in the small back room where her father's old records were kept, her hand resting against the cool wood of the shelf, breathing slowly until the strange, disorienting feeling in her chest began to ease. She thought of all the years she had carried the date of Thomas's loss as a fixed and certain fact, a small stone she had built the whole architecture of her grief around, and wondered now, standing alone in that quiet room, what it might mean if even that single certainty proved less solid than she had always believed. Agnes sat alone by the fire for a long while before she allowed herself to touch the seal of that letter, and in that quiet stretch of waiting, she found herself thinking not of endings, but of beginnings, of a spring morning so many decades past when a young farmer's son had first pressed a sprig of heather into her palm along the riverbank. It seemed strange to her, in that suspended hour, that a single sealed envelope could hold within it the power to reach so far back across the whole of her life, gathering up every year she had spent tending an empty pigeonhole and asking, gently, what it had all been for. The fire popped softly beside her, throwing small shifting shadows across the room, and outside her window the village had already settled into its evening quiet, lamplight glowing warm behind curtained windows up and down the lane. She read the opening lines slowly, deliberately, the way she might once have read the first letters he sent her all those decades before, savoring each phrase rather than rushing toward whatever the rest of the page might hold. He had begun, as he so often had, with some small observation about the world around him, a description of the particular gray of the sky that morning, a wry, gentle joke about the quality of the tea his unit had been issued, small ordinary details that brought him back to her more vividly than any grand declaration could have managed. It was, she thought, so entirely like him, this instinct to ground even his most difficult letters in the small, steadying details of ordinary life, as though he understood, better than most, that comfort so often lived in the smallest things. She thought, too, of all the versions of this moment she had once imagined for herself, back in those early months when hope still felt entirely reasonable, and later in the harder years when she had almost stopped allowing herself to imagine it at all. She had pictured, so many times, Thomas himself walking back through her door, weathered but whole, to claim whatever waited for him in that small wooden space. She had never once pictured this instead. A stranger's gentle knock, a trunk full of scattered family history, and a letter arriving not from Thomas's hand directly into hers, but carried across decades by a great-nephew neither of them could have imagined. When at last she broke the seal, her hands were steadier than she expected them to be, as though some quiet part of her had been waiting so long for this moment that it had long since made its peace with whatever the letter might contain. The paper inside had yellowed with age. The ink faded in places where damp and time had done their slow, patient work, but enough remained legible for Agnes to read. And as her eyes moved across those familiar loops and careful slants of handwriting she had not seen in 40 years, she felt the whole of the room around her seemed to grow very soft and very quiet, as though the fire itself had lowered its voice out of respect for what was unfolding. For a moment she simply looked at the handwriting itself, before reading a single word of it, marveling at how completely, after all these years, she could still recognize the particular pressure of his pen, the small flourish he always gave to the letter T. Thomas had written the letter, she came to understand, in the days just before the engagement that would take him from her, and his words carried none of the fear or uncertainty she might have expected from a man writing so close to danger. Instead, his letter was full of the same gentle, steady warmth she remembered so clearly, page after page recalling small details of home. The particular way morning light fell across the village green, the sound of the river beneath the willows, and Beatrice's mother's bread, still warm, carried through the post office door on cold mornings. He wrote, too, of small moments among his fellow soldiers, of a shared joke that had kept their spirits up through a difficult march, of a young man in his unit who reminded him, in certain small ways, of Freddie Coombe, though Freddie himself would not be born for years yet. He wrote of missing her voice, of counting the days until he might hear it again, and of a quiet, private hope he had been carrying that when this was all finally over, they might build the life together they had only begun to imagine on that autumn afternoon by the river. But it was the final page of the letter that Agnes read most slowly, her eyes returning to certain lines again and again, as though committing them at last and fully to memory. Thomas had written, with a tenderness that reached across all the decades between them, that whatever happened in the days ahead, he did not want her to carry sorrow on his behalf longer than her own heart could bear. He told her, in words she would return to many times in the days that followed, that he had always believed a life well lived was measured not in the waiting, but in the living, and that if fate should keep him from coming home to her, his truest wish was not that she should wait for him forever, but that she should find whatever joy this life still had to offer her, and take it fully, without guilt, without hesitation, and without ever believing that loving him again required her to stop living her own life in the meantime. He wrote, too, of the pigeonhole itself, the small space she had promised to keep for him, telling her gently that while he was deeply moved by the gesture, she must never let it become a cage rather than a comfort, that he wanted it to hold, if anything, not an empty waiting but whatever good things came to fill her days, whether or not those days ever included him again. It was this passage, more than any other, that Agnes read 3 times over, feeling something in her chest loosen with each reading, as though a knot tied 40 years earlier were finally, gently coming undone. There was a tenderness in this particular passage that undid her more completely than almost anything else in the letter, for it revealed a foresight in Thomas she had not fully appreciated even in the years she had known him best, that even facing whatever uncertainty lay ahead of him, he had thought carefully, deliberately, about the shape her life might take in his absence, and had wanted, more than anything, to free her from any obligation to grieve him in a way that diminished rather than enriched the years still ahead of her. She understood, reading this, that his love for her had never been a possessive thing, never a claim staked on her future, but something far gentler and more generous, a wish for her flourishing above all else. He closed the letter simply, telling her that whatever became of him, the heather he had given her by the river would always mean exactly what it had meant that autumn afternoon, and that he hoped, more than anything else, that she would go on to gather many more such moments in her life, with or without him standing beside her to see them. Agnes sat with the letter long after she had finished reading it, the fire burning low and steady beside her, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that what moved through her in that moment was not the sharp, fresh grief she might once have feared, but something gentler, something closer to a long overdue release. 40 years she had spent tending a space meant for a return that had never come, believing, in some deep unspoken corner of herself, that to let go of the waiting would somehow mean letting go of him entirely. But here, in his own hand, was the truth she had never allowed herself to imagine, that Thomas himself had never wanted her waiting to become her whole life. He had wanted, more than anything, for her to live. She sat with that thought for a long while, letting it settle fully into her, feeling the shape of her whole life shift slightly beneath its weight, not violently, but the way a house settles slowly on its foundations over many years, adjusting almost imperceptibly to some new understanding. She thought of all the mornings she had dusted that pigeonhole, believing, in some quiet, unexamined corner of herself, that she was honoring Thomas by keeping her life small around his absence. She understood now, reading his own words, that he had never wanted that kind of honoring at all. He had wanted her joy. He had wanted, simply and entirely, for the woman he loved to go on living a full and generous life, whether or not that life ever included him, and the recognition of this, though it came so many years too late for her to have lived differently, brought with it a comfort she had not expected to find. She rose after a while and moved to the small window beside her chair, looking out at the dark lane beyond, the last of the village's lamps flickering warm against the early evening. She thought of Thomas standing exactly where he had always stood in her memory, young and steady and entirely certain of the life he hoped they might build together, and found, to her quiet surprise, that thinking of him now brought none of the old sharp ache she had carried for so long, but something softer, something closer to gratitude. Whatever had become of him, wherever the war had finally taken him, he had loved her fully and honestly, in the short time they had been given, and that love, she understood now, had never required her waiting to remain real. It had simply been real, complete in itself, whole and finished on its own terms, regardless of how the years that followed had unfolded. There was no anger in this realization, no bitterness at the years spent tending an empty slot at the end of her sorting wall. There was only a soft, settling sadness, and beneath it, something that felt remarkably like peace, the sense of a very old question finally being answered, not with the ending she had once hoped for, but with an ending she could, at last, fully understand. She thought, in the quiet hours that followed, of all the small ways her waiting had shaped her life, not entirely without joy, for there had been genuine joy in her decades at the post office, in the friendships she had built with Beatrice and the Reverend and half the village besides, in the steady comfort of a life spent tending other people's letters and, in her own quiet way, tending their hearts alongside them. She had not, she realized now, spent 40 years merely waiting. She had built, without quite recognizing it as such, an entire life of quiet meaning around that waiting, one filled with genuine warmth even as it carried, at its center, this one unresolved ache. But there had also been a door, somewhere within her, that she had never fully allowed herself to open, a door that Thomas's own words were now, so gently and so many years too late, finally inviting her to walk through. When Peter returned the following morning, he found Agnes already waiting for him near the stove, the letter resting carefully on the counter beside her. And though her eyes carried the soft evidence of a night spent in quiet reflection, there was a lightness in her that had not been there the day before, a settling of something that had rested heavily on her for the whole of her adult life. She shared with him, in her own unhurried way, as much of the story as felt right to share, and Peter listened with the same patient tenderness he had shown throughout his visit, understanding, without needing to be told, that he had unknowingly carried the final piece of a story that Hollowmere itself had been quietly waiting to complete for 40 years. He told her, when she finished, that he was glad the letter had found its way to her after all, however long the journey had taken, and that his grandmother, had she lived to see this day, would have been glad of it too. They sat together a while longer that morning, the stove crackling steadily beside them, and Agnes found herself telling Peter, in fuller detail than she had permitted herself before, the whole shape of the promise she had made so many decades earlier, the pigeonhole cleared and kept ready, the years of quiet, unwavering devotion to a return she had never fully allowed herself to stop hoping for. Peter listened without interruption, his expression carrying none of the pity she might once have feared such a confession would invite, only a deep and genuine tenderness, and when she finished, He told her simply that he thought it was one of the most quietly remarkable things he had ever heard, a testament not to grief, but to love steadily kept. It was Agnes who suggested, before Peter's visit to the village drew to its close, that they might return together to the small pigeonhole at the end of her sorting wall, the one that had stood empty through 4 decades of mornings, dusted and tended with a devotion the whole village had long since stopped questioning aloud. And it was there, in the soft afternoon light of the post office, that Agnes Winslow finally placed something inside that small wooden space for the very first time since the autumn Thomas Reed had left for the war and never returned. She did not place it there out of grief, nor out of any lingering hope that he might yet walk through that door to claim it. She placed it there, instead, as a woman finally choosing to honor a promise fully kept, on both sides, across all the years that had separated them. And as she stepped back to look at the letter resting quietly in its place at last, she felt something within her settle into a stillness she had not known in longer than she could remember, a peace that asked nothing further of her, and required nothing further to be resolved. In the days that followed, Hollowmere seemed to settle into a quieter, gentler version of itself, though most of the village could not have said exactly why. Peter Reed remained a little longer than he had originally planned, staying through the turning of the season as autumn began to touch the hills with color, and in that time he came to know the village his great-uncle had once called home in a way few visitors ever truly do. He walked the same riverbank path where Thomas and Agnes had once spent their quiet afternoons together. The willows, now heavy with turning leaves, sat with Reverend Aldridge in the hush of the old church, listening to stories of the parish that stretched back generations, and shared more than one warm loaf of bread at Beatrice's kitchen table, listening to stories of a village that had, in its own patient way, been waiting alongside Agnes the whole time, without ever quite knowing what it was waiting for. He told her, in the quiet moments before his departure, that he felt he understood his own family a little more fully now, that the great-uncle who had been, for most of his life, little more than a name in an old family story had become, through these weeks in Hollowmere, someone he could almost imagine having known himself. He said he was grateful to have met the woman his great-uncle had loved, and that he hoped, whatever else came of his visit, she would remember it as something good rather than something merely difficult, a gift rather than a disruption to the quiet life she had built. He spent one particular afternoon walking the eastern edge of the village with Reverend Aldridge, out toward the old Reed family land where Thomas had grown up, now farmed by a different family entirely, the original farmhouse long since rebuilt and expanded beyond recognition. Peter stood for a long while at the edge of that land regardless, trying to picture the young man he had come to know only through old letters and older photographs walking these same fields as a boy, and found, in the quiet autumn light, a settled sense of connection to a place and a history he had never expected to feel so deeply. Beatrice, once she understood the fuller shape of what had happened, found herself unexpectedly tearful over her own kitchen table, reaching across to press Peter's hand with real warmth, telling him that whatever had brought him to Hollowmere, the village owed him a debt it could never properly repay. Peter, embarrassed by the sentiment though clearly moved by it, said only that he felt he owed something to Hollowmere too, a fuller understanding of the great-uncle whose name he had carried, in some vague and unexamined way, his whole life without ever truly knowing the man behind it. Before he returned to London, Peter left the remainder of Thomas's letters and photographs in Agnes's keeping, insisting gently that they belonged with her far more than they belonged in a trunk in a London attic. Agnes accepted them with quiet gratitude, and in the weeks that followed, she found a small wooden box in which to keep them, tucked carefully on a shelf in her cottage beside her father's old ledger book, where the pressed sprig of heather still rested, its color faded but its shape unbroken, exactly as it had been for 40 years. On the morning of his departure, she walked with him to the coach stop herself, an unusual gesture for a woman who so rarely left her post before the day's business was done. And the two of them stood together for a few quiet minutes on the very spot where, decades before, she had once watched Thomas's coach pull away. Peter promised to write and to visit again if his research ever brought him back this way, and Agnes told him with real warmth that he would always be welcome at Hollowmere's post office, whatever letters he might have to send. The village fair that autumn, held later in the season than usual owing to a stretch of poor weather, saw Agnes attend for the first time in longer than anyone could recall. Standing among the stalls of ribbon and honey cakes with a cup of warm cider in her hand, watching the children chase one another across the green with an ease in her posture that more than one neighbor remarked upon afterward. Beatrice, watching her old friend from across the green that evening, felt something in her own chest loosen at the sight, a quiet gratitude for whatever had shifted in Agnes these past weeks. Though she still did not know, and would not learn for some time yet, the fuller story behind the change. The village noticed, in the gentle way villages notice such things, that something in Agnes had softened. She still opened the post office before dawn each morning, still lit the little stove in the corner, still greeted every visitor with the same warm and steady welcome she always had. But there was an ease in her now that had not been there before, a lightness in the way she moved through her days, as though some quiet burden she had carried for so long that she had stopped noticing its weight had finally, gently, been set down. Mrs. Halloway remarked to her husband one evening that the postmistress seemed, of late, to laugh more easily than she had in years, and old Tom Fielding observed, in his own quiet way, that Agnes had taken to lingering on the green some mornings, exchanging a few unhurried words with neighbors before returning to her counter, something she had rarely done before. She continued to tend the pigeonhole at the end of the sorting wall, though its purpose had changed entirely. It no longer stood empty, waiting for a return that would never come. Instead, it held, folded carefully inside an envelope of its own, the letter Thomas had written all those years before, along with a single small photograph Peter had left with her, the two of them resting together in the space that had once represented 40 years of quiet, unanswered hope, and now represented something else entirely. Promise kept, a love honored fully on both sides, across all the years that had come between them. Beatrice noticed the change most of all, for she had walked alongside Agnes through more of those quiet years than anyone else in the village, and she began to see, in the months that followed, small signs of a woman gently stepping back into a fuller version of her own life. Agnes accepted an invitation, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, to join a small gathering of village women for tea on a Sunday afternoon that had nothing to do with the post. She began, on slow afternoons, to walk the riverbank path simply for the pleasure of the walk itself, rather than out of any old habit of memory. She even spoke once of perhaps visiting the coast the following summer, a suggestion so unlike her that Beatrice had to hide her smile behind her teacup, quietly grateful for whatever had shifted, at last, in her oldest friend. Freddie Coombe, too, noticed that Agnes seemed somehow lighter that autumn, though being 12 and full of his own small concerns. He thought little of it beyond being glad that she still always had a biscuit waiting for him. Winter came to Hollowmere in its usual slow and gentle way that year, the first frost settling over the hills, the evenings drawing in earlier with each passing week. The post office continued its familiar rhythms, the small brass bell above the door chiming its greetings to villagers bundled against the cold, the stove in the corner burning steadily through the shortened afternoons. Agnes moved through these final months of the year with the same quiet devotion she always had, though those who knew her best could see, in the small unguarded moments between tasks, a woman who had finally made a kind of peace with the whole of her own story, rather than only the parts she had once believed she was allowed to keep. She wrote, that winter, a long letter of her own to Peter in London, thanking him properly for what he had brought her, and received in return a warm reply, the beginning of a correspondence the two of them would keep up gently for years to come, an unexpected friendship grown from an old, unfinished story. There would be other winters after that one, other snowfalls settling softly over Hollowmere's rooftops, other mornings when Agnes rose before the dawn to open her small post office and tend, with the same quiet devotion as always, the space at the end of her sorting wall. But something in the character of her waiting had changed permanently that autumn, transformed from a held breath into something closer to remembrance, gentle and unburdened, carried forward not as an ache but as a steady, quiet thread woven now fully and peacefully into the whole rich fabric of her long life. Their letters, over that first winter, grew steadily warmer and more familiar, and Agnes found herself looking forward to his replies with a small, private pleasure she had not felt in longer than she could remember. The simple anticipation of hearing from someone who had come to matter to her in his own right, quite apart from whatever connection he carried to her past. She told him, in one such letter, about the village's small doings, the same sort of gentle, steady details she had once written to Thomas so many decades before, though this time the writing carried none of the old ache, only the simple pleasure of a growing friendship freely given. Peter wrote back of his own quiet life in London, of small discoveries in his archival work, of a growing interest, sparked by his time in Hollowmere, in returning to visit the village again the following spring, perhaps to see the orchards in bloom, perhaps simply to sit once more by the stove in the post office and hear whatever stories Agnes was willing to share. On the evening of the first snowfall, as the village settled into the hush that only a fresh blanket of snow can bring, Agnes closed the post office a little later than usual, lingering a moment longer than necessary to watch the snow gather softly against the window panes, catching the last of the lamplight in a way that reminded her, gently and without sorrow, of another autumn evening from so many years before. She banked the fire in the stove, gathered her coat and shawl and paused, as she always did, at the far end of the sorting wall, resting her hand lightly against the small wooden pigeonhole that had shaped so much of her life. She did not dust it out of longing that evening, nor out of any lingering ache for what might have been. She touched it instead the way one might touch an old photograph, or a well-worn book, with the simple, settled fondness of someone remembering a life fully lived, rather than a life spent only in waiting. Outside, the snow continued to fall in slow, silent drifts over the sleeping rooftops of Hollowmere, softening every rooftop and hedgerow and cobblestone lane into a single unbroken hush, the whole village folding gently into the deep and peaceful quiet of a winter's night. Beatrice would later say that it was around this time that Agnes truly seemed, for the first time in 40 years, entirely at rest, and perhaps that was the truest way to describe what had changed. Not an ending exactly, not in the way endings are so often imagined, sudden and complete, but something closer to a long, slow exhale, the quiet settling of a held breath that had lasted the better part of a lifetime, finally released into the soft and forgiving hush of the present. The village of Hollowmere, in its own patient way, had never needed to fully understand what Agnes Winslow had carried all those years. It had simply loved her, steadily and without question, through every quiet morning she opened her door before the sun had risen, through every empty pigeonhole dusted with unexplained devotion, through every small kindness she had folded so carefully into a life that had, in the end, held far more warmth and far more love than even she had once believed it could. And so, as the snow continued to fall softly over the sleeping village, and the last lamp in the post office window dimmed at last into darkness, the story of Agnes Winslow settled gently into the long, quiet history of Hollowmere, not as a tale of loss, but as a tale of love that had been tended, faithfully and without complaint, until it finally found its own peaceful place to rest. Somewhere beneath the snow, the river continued its slow, silver path past the willows where two young people had once walked together on an autumn afternoon so long ago, carrying with it, as rivers always do, every quiet story a village has ever chosen to remember, and letting each one drift gently onward into the soft and endless dark. Thanks for listening. Sleep well.